believe this is a final verdict on the failed economic policies of the last 8 years, strongly promoted by President Bush and supported by Senator McCain, that essentially said that we should strip away regulations, consumer protections, let the market run wild, and prosperity would rain down on all of us. It hasn't worked out that way.
Part of what got us into this entire mess is Fannie and Freddie Mac and the fiasco. Politicians, of course, all blaming one another. Barack Obama pointing the finger away from himself. But my next guest says that group ACORN, we were just talking about a moment ago, a group that has endorsed Obama for president, is at the root of this big financial mess. Now, ACORN is the same group that's being investigated for allegations of voter fraud in states across the country. Here to explain this right now is Stanley Kurtz. He's a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Institute. Hi there, Stanley. So explain to us the connection between ACORN and the subprime mess that got us into this big economic mess to begin with.
ACORN is a group of very radical community organizers. They've been very strongly supported by Barack Obama, although he sometimes likes to deny that connection. Obama has channeled the funds to ACORN from various foundations he's been on. He's done training for ACORN of their leaders. And what ACORN does is they try to intimidate banks into giving these high-risk loans to low-credit customers. This is what they did for years, especially in the late 80s and early 90s.
What do you mean? What kind of stuff do these ACORN activists do to try to get banks to lend money to people who are in the subprime market?
They would flood protesters into the lobbies of banks, scare away customers. They would send protesters to the homes of bankers. They would break into private offices of bankers to scare them. And they would file complaints under something called the Community Reinvestment Act, which is a law that ACORN used to try to force these banks to make these high-risk loans.
Now, on the other hand, though, some of these banks did want to get into the subprime market because they could make higher margins that way. What about that?
In the early 90s, that wasn't happening. The banks were resisting ACORN at that early point. And what happened at that point was that ACORN realized that they would never bring the banks around to these high-risk loans unless it got Fannie and Freddie in on the game. Because the banks would say, hey, we can only make but so many of these risky loans to you because Fannie and Freddie won't buy them. They have very high credit standards. So ACORN went to its Washington lobbyists. It put a lot of pressure on its Democratic allies in Congress. And that's how Fannie and Freddie got their credit standards changed and really watered down so tremendously. Then everyone said, oh, we can make a lot of money at this. But what really started the contagion of these bad loans was the pressure from ACORN and Democrats onto Fannie and Freddie.
Now, we had heard a lot about some of the Democrats on the Hill who didn't fully investigate Fannie and Freddie, and lots of people upset about that. But we haven't really heard this angle at all about ACORN going into the banks, say, lower your standards, give people who can't afford these homes, give them loans, and bringing us to this point. So what do we do now? ACORN's getting a bunch of money from the federal government under the housing bill that was signed into law by the president and passed by the Democratic Congress last summer.
Well, I think the outcome of the election is going to make a huge difference as far as that goes. If McCain comes in, I think ACORN's going to get seriously investigated. And if Barack Obama comes in and they've got one of their best friends in the world as president, I think they're going to be in gravy.
All right, Stanley Kurtz, we're going to have to leave it there. You've been following the ACORN angle for quite some time, often writing for the Wall Street Journal. Thanks a lot. And we'll keep an eye out for any of the work that you've got going on. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Heather.
All right, fair and balanced now. Let us get reaction from Senator Obama's camp. The DNC senior advisor, Brad Woodhouse, is here. Brad, how do you respond to Howard Kurtz's story?
Hey, Brian, thanks for having me. Well, I tell you, I just have to, in amazement, I guess, is the best way to put it. I mean, you know, Mr. Kurtz has pulled together some sensational stories. He's pulled together a string of quotes and accusations on right-wing blogs into an article that you all are promoting today. I mean, the truth of the matter is, and this is Business Week, this is not me talking, 80% of the loans that were done in the subprime market were done by banks and mortgage service companies that were not subject to supervision of the Community Reinvestment Act. So what he's saying is just not factually true. I mean, I don't
did want to get into the subprime market because they could make higher margins that way. What about that?
In the early 90s, that wasn't happening. The banks were resisting ACORN at that early point. And what happened at that point was that ACORN realized that they would never bring the banks around to these high-risk loans unless it got Fannie and Freddie in on the game. Because the banks would say, hey, we can only make but so many of these risky loans to you because Fannie and Freddie won't buy them. They have very high credit standards. So ACORN went to its Washington lobbyists. It put a lot of pressure on its Democratic allies in Congress. And that's how Fannie and Freddie got their credit standards changed and really watered down so tremendously. Then everyone said, oh, we can make a lot of money at this. But what really started the contagion of these bad loans was the pressure from ACORN and Democrats onto Fannie and Freddie.
Yeah, but you're hitting on the mortgage angle. What about Senator Obama's relationship with the Woods Foundation and ACORN?
Well, let me just say this. I mean, Senator Obama's never been an employee of ACORN, never done any training for ACORN. At one point in his career, he and a bunch of other lawyers represented a bunch of groups, including ACORN,